Good morning, everyone. A little bit of opening words from me. Welcome to today's online session about the 2025 edition of the Nostradamus Report. It's wonderful to see so many people here across Europe. I'm putting myself up first so you can see me better. My name is Liisa Sauri, and I'm the head of Creative Europe Desk in Finland. We operate here in Helsinki in the Finnish Film Foundation, and we mainly focus on the media sub-program of the EU funding program here. And this event is organized together with 12 different Creative Europe countries and desks, and the countries are Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Hungary, Ireland, Italy, Germany, Latvia, Norway, Portugal, Slovenia, and Sweden. And this is actually the first time that our Finnish team is organizing such a big international event online at this scale, and of course there's always some hiccup somewhere. So at one point I discovered that my notifications to the registrations were going out in Finnish. So I'm really sorry about that. I'm really happy that you have still found your way to our event, even though we were messaging in a weird Nordic language. So, but to the topic of the day, the Nostradamus report is commissioned annually by the Göteborg Film Festival and supported by Creative Europe. And it is definitely one of the key analyses helping us to understand how the audiovisual industries are changing and how we might respond. For us in Finland, organizing this session felt particularly timely and important this fall because earlier this autumn, our national film industry faced rather significant cuts or a threat of cuts, budget cuts to the public production support managed by the Finnish Film Foundation. But just yesterday, we received the very positive news that these cuts actually were cancelled. It's been a whirlwind, but and you can like literally hear the sigh of relief in Helsinki. But I think this turbulent process has been a good example of how public funding is actually in turbulence all over Europe, because in Europe, Film Foundation relies heavily on public support. And these are exactly the kind of structural and cultural themes and changes that the Nostradamus report helps us to reflect on. So we are delighted to today have Johanna Koljonen as our speaker to present the report. Welcome, Johanna.
Thank you very much. I guess, should I just go?
I think you can just go, and we have reserved a bit of time in the end. Johanna is going to speak for approximately an hour, and in the end we will have a little bit of time for Q&A. And if you have questions of themes that you would like to discuss, there's a Q&A function here in Teams where you can add your questions and you can even upvote other people's questions. So please, Johanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Sometimes I like to speak with like a very professional tone and be very calm and like try to pass for an adult. And I usually think that's a sensible thing to do when you talk about serious subjects and so on. I will maybe not be able to do that this morning for the following reasons. One, I had, of course, prepared to talk about these very radical cuts in Finland as an example of the many things I will be talking about from this year's report. And they have been, without explanation, cancelled last night, which is fantastic news, but not ideal for my slides. Then I arrive at my office to start the presentation, and I am forced to do some kind of systems update on my main computer, after which the camera doesn't work anymore. So we're now on my laptop, and this is like a very sort of dodgy setup. And in addition, I seem to have some kind of problem with my contact lens. So kind of on brand for what the report also is talking about, I think today I'm just going to have to just like accept and level with you about the fact that while I feel pretty confident in my analysis, I am also very human. And this humanity is maybe a little bit more present this morning than I would otherwise have wished. I'm going to be talking about for about an hour, maybe a little bit more, and just like friends are waving, colleagues from across Europe are waving. Nice to see you all here, and also nice to see all of these familiar names. And some of you, I think, will have heard all of this before. But what I'm here to do today is to present the 12th annual Nostradamus report. It's called Reality/Resistance. I'm a media analyst. I'm not an academic researcher. In fact, I am an academic researcher, but this is not academic research. What we're doing here. I'll talk a little bit about the process, but it's a good thing to know that this is kind of expert advice with a fair amount of like vibes and sort of cultural analysis. But this does not have the kind of sort of truth claims that it would if it had gone through like a rigorous academic process. And of course, the reason for that is that we do one of these a year and we want to be really fast. And what we are looking at and what we want to present is quite a lot of like, yes, it's based, of course, in numbers and market data, but what we're also very much trying to do is to talk about how does it feel and how do people who have deep expertise, what is their intuition, which they can't always explain why, but their experience guides them to see certain things that they can't always quite explain. And it's those kinds of things that I'm also trying to sort of lift up in this work. Historically, our goal was, this is the 12th report. And historically, let's say like 7-8 years back, certainly we always had this thing, we're looking 3 to 5 years ahead to see what happens. In some ways, I think we still do that, but the nature of the changes we're going through has changed. This sort of digitalization journey has kind of ended or is like landing. The consequences, the pieces are still falling, but basically we've gone through the change into streaming, the digitization of the whole value chain, the sort of rise and now starting fall of social media. All of this has sort of happened, and the current things which are sort of top of mind structurally speaking, which is the sort of political uncertainty and AI, which I won't be talking about today, so please ask about it and at the end if instead. Those are by their nature change processes which are much more difficult to predict. This report is commissioned by the Göteborg Film Festival, and I work in very close collaboration with the industry team there in the preparation of this report. It's funded by Swedish and European impact multipliers who are all in different ways invested in resilient industry change. And you could say that resilient industry change is kind of our new, like this the mission that we've drifted into in this sort of uncertain prediction environment. Boost Helsingborg is a public innovation hub for the audiovisual industries in southern Sweden. Lindholmen Science Park has a similar innovation role in Gothenburg, where our festival is based. Kulturakademin is an upskilling and education service provider for professionals across the arts in Sweden. And German Film, of course, supports international circulation. They're the most recent to join us. We're really, really happy for this support. And as always, with us are Creative Europe Media and Nordisk Film och TV Fond and the region of Västra Götaland. So of course this Creative Europe connection, which has been with us since the very beginning, makes me extra proud to speak in this context today. The way this report is done is that I speak at great length and depth to our interviewees who are always in strategic positions across the industry. This year they are 7 and represent public service drama commissioners, talent management, talent, film education and professional training, audience development perspectives, development funding, and of course also independent production. And I want to thank all of our interviewees. They are represented in this report by their quote. They are not responsible for the surrounding text or any of the conclusions or recommendations. That's all me and the team. And in this presentation, additionally, I've had sometimes to sort of cut the quotes a little bit further and shorten them. So if you want to quote them because they are brilliant, please look them up in the report, which you can totally download for free. And I'll give you a link at the end. Okay. So here too, we're starting in reality. And this is, of course, a reality that looks different specifically today than it did in May when the report was released in Cannes. But as Roman Paul tells us here in this quote, I'm in the academy, and in my group, 20-something short films from Gaza were submitted this year by Palestine. There were images in them I wish I had never seen, but even with just their phones, people were trying to tell stories, not only of the unspeakable suffering, but also about their dreams that will always exist somehow. And I'm not going to go into the shameful and illegal and cruel things that are happening in Gaza and have been happening now for some years, because I think you all know. I will just say that, of course, I fervently pray that it's over. And even if it would be over, even if it is over, let's hope that it is ending. It's not going to be over for the people for the survivors who are affected in Gaza, and of course also in Israel, and for the families who have been affected. We will be living with this stain on humanity and this cruelty for generations. And again, this is one of those things where foreseeing the future is very, very difficult. So the question I asked, the reason I started with this particular quote in the report and in this presentation, is that the question for our industry perhaps is that there is an enormous, and I think what has happened in the last few years in Gaza has revealed in all of us, this enormous cultural and individual ability to rationalize and ignore human suffering, which I think that many of us were hoping that we didn't have, that we have thought that, well, that kind of ignoring what is going on or accepting our own powerlessness, as it often is belongs to a different age or some different kind of person than we individually are. I think we will have to deal with the fact that we are also those kinds of people who have been able to stand on the sidelines and somehow continue our lives in this situation. And how do we act in the world, and how do we live with ourselves? And how do we in film make films and audiovisual storytelling about the human experience when we live in an age where it's very clear that reality will continue to harden us against human experience? But our job has to be somehow to stay soft without being soft, like to not be pushovers, but to still have an openness in our hearts to reality and to the human experiences of reality. The paradox of perspective is central to this year's report, and I'm going to return to it in different ways today. And I also want to just signify here that of course, like once you have put this theme on the table, everything else I'm going to say might sound completely irrelevant. What is the appropriate balance when we are talking about genocidal atrocities or murders of civilians? When you're talking about filmmakers and journalists being beat up in their homes or disappeared or killed, like how do we, in this context, in this age, how do we then also talk about how difficult it is to distribute independent cinema without sounding completely heartless? And I think that's the question. But both of these things, they're different kinds of important, but they are both important in their different ways, and also important in the long term. So on one way, yes, like what are we doing? What should we be doing? And I think in most professions and most in my generation, certainly I'm 47 years old, like I grew up in a situation where I genuinely believed that the world is largely speaking getting better, and I will live in peace for all of my life. And I don't have to think very much about what I should be doing. I think about what I want to be doing. And these are questions that we really need to grapple with. This is a question certainly of the report, and I think maybe the rest of our lives. And I also have an answer, by the way. It's not prescriptive, but like what I think is correct is that what we should be doing is the best we can. The best we can. And this also applies, and it especially applies to our industry troubles. So especially in Europe, because of our public support system, we have had this sort of culture of expecting someone else to come and save us. But when something is difficult in our industry, for instance, we're hit by these huge structural changes in the technologies. But a lot of places in the world and in our societies need help now and will keep needing help. And we might feel powerless about the wider world. And in some ways we are, in some ways we aren't, but we certainly are not powerless to transform our own work practices, our workplaces, to transform this industry, to make it more resilient so we can continue to exist, to make it more relevant. And in the end, That is the greatest platform, I think, for impact on the world that any of us in this call have. And if you have some other greater impact, great, like, but then go, maybe like you should be acting there. But most of us, really, this industry is the medium through which we work. Whenever I have a slide that looks like this, it represents a chapter in the report, and I'm going to run through them all way too fast, probably. And then I have made a note here. Next time, do not use a chapter headline that I can't use or that I can't pronounce. But this one is called From Reality Resistant to Resilient Resistance. And what this chapter argues on a sort of high level is that historically our industry has been somewhat reality resistant, and that can be a strength. And nevertheless, it's also a weakness in the sense that we can be in denial about reality, and that we have to stop. We have to stop denying the nature of reality, by which I don't only mean like the political situation in the world and so on, but like also just things that are true about our industries locally and on a higher European or global level. And only by facing the facts can we actually resist the outcomes of some of these changes. So starting with the situation of the film and TV industries, it is objectively terrible. Still, there is a commissioning crunch that comes from the sort of receding of the sort of streaming wars. Very inappropriate to use the word wars there now, I guess, yes. But the streaming competitive investment has stopped. And this means, and also the structural changes have had as a result, that there are huge mismatches between the different phases of the audiovisual value chain. Some people say that the producers are too many. I'm not sure that the producers are too many, but certainly it's the case that we produce still, even now, feature films, especially at volumes that are not proportional to what the rest of the system can currently sustain. And at the same time, well, this is awful, yes, like we're not working in the mines. And there's a thing that is not currently very visible, which is that the reason that we are producing so much and at such high, like solid quality often, is that in the boom, through these technological changes and in the boom years that we've come out of now, many production industries across Europe and the world have grown and matured in capacity and in skill. But all of us are now operating in a much more volatile environment than we historically have been. And we will continue to do that for the rest of our lives because of climate, because of other reasons of political environment. And this requires totally new levels of adaptability and resilience in our work. So we need to have mental and financial margins. We need to have a little bit of padding and a little bit of like extra strength with us so that when a curveball is thrown at us, like let's say a war of aggression on Ukraine or Russia's attack that is on Ukraine is causing inflation, and that disappears a significant portion of your project's funding. How do we handle that? And of course, yeah, no, this problem is nothing compared to the people who are directly affected, to compare certainly not how the people of Ukraine and its film industry are affected, but to that project and to the people involved, it's a huge problem nevertheless. And this kind of thing will keep happening. And by that, I mean every kind of thing. Maybe your co-production partner was based in Valencia when the floods hit, or maybe the forest fires in Sweden are going to stop outdoor shoots just when you were supposed to be in production. And this chapter, which I urge, of course, you all to read, argues that we are prepared to handle, because to be able to work in film at all, you need to be an optimist and you need to have a huge sort of day-to-day agility in how to solve problems and manage your tasks. So the very qualities that are necessary to work in film at all, because let's be real, working in film is crazy. But if you have managed to do that and continue, then you also have the sort of fundamental wiring that is required to manage living in this world that we live in now. But we do have to actually use those skills that we have. And in a favorite quote in this report, it has a wider context, but just to take it out of context, Tamara Tatishvili says, there's nothing wrong with a panel, but do we really need them in these quantities? Our industry attracts opinionated, articulate people. Our challenge is translating those needs and all of these things that we say on these panels into actionable professional practice. So in summary, film storytelling has a paradoxical relationship with reality. We escape reality through film, but film also is focused and made clear through, but reality is also focused and made clear through film. Similarly, paradoxically, as film people, we have to be shrewd realists to manage, but we also have to be in complete denial about the odds of any given project succeeding to manage. And this combination, these combined skills of realism and denial and shrewdness is something that we can't now just apply to film, but we have to also apply them to this project of our own resilience as individuals, as companies, as organizations, and as a sector. Yeah, one world of different woes. So here, this quote, for instance, offers up one of the central challenges going forward. It's easier, Tamara says, it's easier to say that you're including everyone or that you're neutral and promote a plurality of voices when you wake up every morning in a country with mostly uninterrupted social political development. It's very difficult when you wake up in one of the burning parts of this world. And then you're on a panel at some film market with colleagues and they question why you might feel hesitant to include, for instance, the voice of a political enemy in your project. And she says it's because in real life that is really painful and complicated. And I think that this is just one example of the kind of fractured reality we're living in. Of course, we all know that the sort of media landscape and news coverage is very fractured, and different people also the sort of news consumption of the traditional news consumers is very, very fractured. Probably every one of us is not as well informed as we'd like to be. And we do live in some ways in very different realities. And I have in the report, I have this example of if you're a filmmaker in Beirut, for instance, the kind of things that the local industry just in Beirut has gone through in the last few years with that terrible explosion, and then of course the effects of this war as well, for instance, are huge dramatic impacts on life and on work. But it's also totally possible to be like perhaps to have a co-production partner who kind of is just vaguely aware that like maybe something is happening in Lebanon, or maybe they're not aware at all. And when you meet in a room, working together can be hard. I think if you're Jewish, certainly you have a very like lived experience in Europe of anti-Semitism that is very invisible and to other people, and that might be dismissed as hysterical if you bring it up. I mean, certainly if you're trans or if you have trans family members or colleagues, the experience of that community right now is being targeted and being actively marginalized by relatively political mainstream voices. And with the direct increased violence, for instance, as a consequence. And that is largely invisible to a lot of other people that you might show up in the same meeting room with or on the same set with. And as our experiences are increasingly very different, and also more and more of us probably will have experiences of crisis and loss, or of groups that we belong to having been hurt or attacked or wronged in some way that might be invisible or just not like weighted correctly in our perspective by others. This has some implications for our work. So on the interpersonal level, directly, it's not that long since Me Too started. And let's remember, it started in the film industry, and that's the point when we started to have these conversations that maybe like actual violent crimes in the workplace are not okay. And all of the studies that are done by like experts on our workplaces suggest that we're pretty terrible still at handling just power imbalances that are built into sort of the industry. And also we're very bad at handling as an industry the extreme stress and the effects of the extreme stress that our ways of working have on our coworkers and on ourselves. And that work has started. Safety is developing. We're totally working, have done like structural change, has started to totally change the access and position of and representation of, for instance, underprivileged minorities. But we're still learning. And now like more and more kinds of people, every kind of person may have experiences to work that have affected them very strongly and that they may not feel comfortable talking about. And that also means, or that they may not feel safe being fully received. And it's difficult in an artistic practice to not be able to be fully present. And this also means that on the organizational levels, we need to practice flexibility. How do we step up and take over work when somebody suddenly can't do it for some reasons? If you're a funder, how do you handle an unexpected project setback? Do you go by the book? Or do you understand that this horrible thing, some random thing just happened? How do we create workplaces and work cultures with places for empathy and respect without compromising on our ability to deliver? We have to learn from each other. But I think also just on a higher level, what is a relevant story? Or what is an important act of witnesses, and what is an appropriate artistic expression of human pain? These are decisions that are made all the time in our industry, on the commissioning level, in artistic roles in the project. What is the appropriate way to make art from our experiences, or to tell stories of what is happening in the world? And as that is becoming more shattered, our ability to make those decisions with our traditional tools will be challenged. And also just the question, like, what is commercial? Like, what grounds do we make these decisions, and for whom? Here's a lot that we have to, unfortunately, I don't have the answers, but I do know that we're going to have to start thinking about this. Okay. In the next 3 to 5 years, this industry will resist democratic backsliding or become implicated in it. So in everyday language, the word democracy means a lot of general concepts, and this makes these conversations often quite vague. But if we're talking specifically about sort of the systems of governance on different levels, and the equality and functioning of the law, and the space that citizens have to affect these systems, both formally and informally, this stuff is measurable and it's possible to study. And there is one scorekeeper about changes internationally towards more democracy or more autocracy. That's a global research project called the VDEM Institute, stands for Variants of Democracy Institute. Coincidentally, that project is run from Göteborg, just like our festival. And I do have to say, if you want to read one report out of Göteborg every year, maybe it's not mine, I think you possibly should be reading theirs. But here are some highlights from the last one. According to the VDEM Institute, there are now 91 autocracies in the world, but just 88 democracies of any kind. And the least common regime type in the world right now is liberal democracy, with just 29 countries living up to the definition. And I know you all are from in a lot of different countries, so it's likely that not all of you are living in liberal democracies. Freedom of expression is worsening in 44 countries, up from 35 3 years earlier. 45 countries are currently undergoing a process of autocratization, which is compared to just 25 in 2020. And these are last year's numbers. So now, of course, the US is also clearly in a process of autocratization by these sort of scientific, or like by these definitions. And once autocratization gets going, democracies can die. The fatality rate for democracies is currently over half. Historically, it's about half lead ultimately to democratic outcomes. So it looks in the short term as though it's worsening. Let's see how that goes. And this industry is in this fight, whether we want to or not, because meaning attaches itself to stories. And what I think the democratic systems and institutions and organizations are really struggling with is the telling of the positive story. And I think increasingly now, even though I don't go into this so much in the report, I think it's clear that both the media and the arts have completely failed in keeping an eye on these sort of big picture narratives. I think we do know, or at least suspect, that a lot of the people who are now voting populist, they have not felt very seen or represented in stories about reality. And they haven't heard a story where their concerns are central, or they haven't experienced that they've heard it. And that was happening while many people who are oriented more sort of towards the sort of traditional left or towards the center, they were busy, I would say we were busy with a really important self-reckoning about historical power structures, about representation, about access, about gender in the workplace, and so on. And that reckoning was not just a minority concern, especially if you include women. That's more than half of the world population, right? So this was necessary work, I do believe it, for the long-term health and the relevance for the sector. But I also think that storytellers in art and media, and also politics, honestly, we somehow lost interest in the big social narratives or in telling the story of what is the goal here, like what are we trying to achieve, why do we want a democracy, what is that? That the democracy is a system for solidarity and safety and long-term thinking, and it's not supposed to be about optimizing your short-term gains. And I think we've also failed at telling the story of that democracy by design is a space of tension and disagreement. It's not easy. It's not supposed to be easy. And democracy is a space where we negotiate those tensions in a peaceful way instead of turning on each other. We have not told that story. Like nobody has been telling that story, I think, for a long time. And there was one glaring exception of people who did have a big story going. And that, of course, was the ultranationalists and the outright fascists. They've been telling their same story about their vision for a very long time. And they are also not afraid to exploit structural weaknesses in the democratic systems to just try and replace them. And they can. And this is the thing where, like, when I grew up, I didn't think it was possible for a democracy to end. Clearly, it's possible. That's what the numbers say. And that's also what the news say, but it's so difficult to internalize. A lot of people and institutions need to be telling better stories, both really complex stories and really clear, simple stories. And of course, in that landscape, what film does is very important. This means that there is a vested interest among some parts of society in stopping us from telling stories. And as we have seen across the world and in those numbers I just shared, autocratization may come for us all. And in the report, this chapter is actually not so much about the storytelling. It's about some practical advice about how to think about this threat in the context of your work. If your country is somewhere in this process of autocratization, or maybe it's just earlier in the process, so there's some kind of democratic backsliding, how do we push in the other direction? But also really practically, we have to think about what to do, how to prepare your institution or your company or your family for possible actual risk. Now, I assume most of us, of you who are watching, are in Europe. And there's the thing that I was saying about very different experiences and worldviews. I live in Sweden. Many Swedes find even just like the day-to-day experience of war very different, very difficult to imagine. I come from Finland, so and I'm old enough to have met the World War generation. So to me, that is not as difficult to imagine, right? But I also have close Swedish colleagues who are about my own age, who were born in the Balkans and experienced the wars there in the 90s or in Iran. And their capacity to imagine political upheaval and danger is completely different. And this affects the stories that we tell, of course, the kinds of films we make, but it also just really practically affects things like how do you interpret small political changes? For instance, if your freedom of speech is limited, what can come next? Like, what is it possible for me to imagine might happen next? I think if you're like me, if you're a majority population, middle class person from a stable and rich country with very high levels of trust, like the Nordics, I think it's really difficult to imagine that safety could erode, or that institutions in general might not be on my side. I think if you're living in a young democracy in Europe, and if you're old enough to remember that, or if you or your family have read any kind of authoritarian system, then you probably have in your sort of family memory or your lived experience really good instincts about what the threats are and about how to act. And this is a little bit similar. I've been thinking about how people in low production capacity countries in film have so much better practical experience about affordable production and innovative problem solving and this kind of flexibility that is required when you're producing in really difficult circumstances. I think it's really similar. And I think the sort of lack of respect for this expertise in like quote unquote the West or like the global North or the high production capacity countries, whatever it is, the lack of respect for this expertise is very similar. Yes, of course, we want political and economic safety for everyone, but if we can't have it, and unfortunately, I think not everyone will have it, do you have a mental model for how to keep working? We need to fight back against developments that could lead to more war or dictatorship, working in mass media with potential to reach so many people and influence them as much as a film or series can. We do have a part to play. We can initiate discussions and promote the values we have stood for. We can inspire people to become active and feel empowered and connected. That is our responsibilities as producer of Woman Powell. So if we don't resist democratic backsliding, by which I don't mean activism, but just like resist these processes. I mean, it could be activism, I guess, but in some way we resist this tendency, or we become implicated in it. Those are the choices that we have. We have to fight for editorial and artistic freedom. We have to fight against self-censorship. We have to resist hateful populist framings of contentious issues. As employers and as colleagues in institutions, we must proactively put in place policies and strategies and tools to help protect individual employees and artists and partners from harm. And then we hope we never need them. But if we do, then it's too late to start, right? And most importantly, I ended this slide in May by writing, most importantly, we need to tell complex stories against dehumanization. That is true. But I would now add, we must also tell clear stories about the kind of world we would like to live in. The fourth chapter makes some really rather complex arguments that will sound incredibly sort of simplified in a summary like this. So I would just start by establishing that US content, yes, it still dominates, and these sort of American but global media giants are likely to continue to be bigger and more influential, certainly than any European challengers. But that said, there is another current sort of running underneath. Samia Hafsawi is a Dutch screenwriter. It's like an absolute gem of a thinker. She says here, when I was little, we wanted to do an American high school year. People don't want that anymore. You could be in a school shooting. There is a de-Americanization of millennials and Gen Z happening. The ambition to make, and that's actually also supported by other research. And she talks about how she wanted to be sort of in the US industry, like that was the dream when we were all kids. The ambition to make another country love me because I loved it faded away when I realized it didn't exist. So living in the US and living in the UK made this sort of dream of this sort of Anglo, the world that many of us grew up watching on film doesn't exist. And you don't actually have to live there now to have that experience. That's something a lot of people do because of social media. And when you don't have the ambition to make US culture love you anymore, that's actually something that really affects the American film industry. So we've been living for a long time in this sort of cultural dynamic that is known as Americanization, and that has been challenged for a while. Americanization is the name for sort of the effects or impacts that the US's soft power experts since the Second World War have had on the world. For instance, arguably it's at least part of the reason that I'm speaking to you in English now. It's not all of the reasons, part of it. And all of that has been undermined for many reasons. And I think that my generation, who is sort of Gen X and the eldest millennials, we were probably the last age cohort, at least for a while, that we self-Americanized very willingly and very automatically, and that is actually changing. And in the report, there's much more nuance about this, but basically the normative power of US content is weakened, even though sort of financially it still dominates. And this idea of Hollywood is, for many reasons, losing symbolic value. And that means that over time, the US's position as a sort of norm of what is mainstream in pop culture in the global north, that's changing as well. So, and that was, we take it for granted because it's been the norms for so long, and that was created by not just by the economic structures, but also really by this cultural position, and that is undermined by social media and other reasons. And this means that there are opportunities opening in shifting what is considered to be mainstream storytelling, and especially in this sort of more popular mainstream, more popular genre, like wide appeal genre, so-called mainstream content. The US content industry is also, for reasons again that I go into, they have had structural, like economic incentives to create very generic content because it has to work all over the world, especially, like, essentially. So, and that has also then now, of course, and lately it's been a way to lower economic risk, and that has artistically made it emptier and emptier. And we do see in all markets, and also including actually the US, specialized film and specific film has a wider appeal than it has had for a long time. In Europe, we know that European content recovered better after the pandemic than US content, and art house recovered better and faster there here and in the US than mainstream content, and so on. And of course, now everybody who's involved certainly with the film export, like, does this mean that our European content will do well in Europe, in the US? Actually, kind of it might. But as Ted Miller discusses here in some detail, that the American market historically didn't actually buy foreign content. And that even impacted, I thought it was very funny, this impacted even the kinds of scripted series that were viable. So he says a show like The Diplomat now, which is set abroad, would have been very difficult to sell just 10 years ago before the streamers began producing series. And there was a time when you couldn't even really sell a show with a foreign accent, which is why Hugh Laurie in the TV series House, they didn't want him to be British because that would be too foreign. And of course, this is a very sort of isolated market. And there's also structural reasons, which is that the traditional US buyers they don't have like a buying internationally function in these sort of broadcast organizations and those kinds of media companies inside the US. They don't have a mandate to look for it, and it's the same people who are commissioning their own content. So you are like the person you are selling to is essentially you're competing with their own project. And there also really isn't a market. We do have a big structure for going to the US and buying their content for the rest of the world, but we don't really have a place for instance, for Americans to come and buy British and Korean and Finnish TV shows in some kind of centralized original way. I want to just add to this that the sort of operation of the US media and tech companies under the Trump government, I wrote about that this spring, that if they are very aligned with the MAGA project, that can become a liability for these companies internationally, and that I predicted or expected that if that would happen, it becomes a liability, then brand communication in foreign markets would sort of need to detach itself from the American soft power that their position is largely also or partly built on. And I don't see any signs of that yet. Even though the sort of US globals are actually kowtowing to Trump to like an astonishing degree, to a degree that might even be illegal even in the United States. But that doesn't seem to have any market consequences abroad yet. But we'll see. These are very slow processes. But also, I think it may be a sign that I always underestimate how many Europeans are not so rattled by the MAGA agenda or the tech bro agenda as I am. Yes. So earlier I said we should tell better stories about democracy and society, and I will absolutely admit that is very difficult. This is a storytelling task that we can totally do. So our industry has a bunch of problems, and almost all of them, whether you're talking about the marketplace of attention or changed movie-going behaviors or the attractiveness of this industry to new talent or continued access to public funding, almost anything you talk about, ultimately, what it boils down to is that the long-term health of film as an art form and of our local industries depends on the engagement of the popular audience. Popular audience meaning not everybody all the time, but most people some of the time. And yeah, so I was expecting to talk today about these Finnish budget cuts that were originally announced at 1/3 of the public funding and then corrected to 25% of the public funding, which would have been an absolutely disastrous, of course, for the number of domestic productions, for local cinemas, for many other things, the acting profession. It's an absolute nightmare. And now, miraculously, those cuts have been cancelled without explanation last night. So we're going to find out how that happened. But I may have a theory. Let's see. Why is this thing that I'm talking about? Like, how is all this connected to the engagement of the story of the popular audience? So on the very sort of highest level, actually, this is what I've been talking about this whole hour, but this is sort of, if we break it down into storytelling problems, it's this. and please don't get offended, but like on average, generally speaking, in the European feature film space, an average film does not successfully connect with audiences. There are exceptions, thankfully, but most of them, numerically, I'm afraid, don't. And that can be a problem of quality. It can be a problem of relevance. Sometimes it's also just a problem of the difficulty of finding the work or even getting it out there. But let's be real, in a competitive situation, work with a lot of relevance does actually get out there. So I think we have to just look in the mirror and say we have a relevance problem and possibly sometimes often a quality problem as well. Then we are telling in the industry stories about the audience, which are very dubious. I will still I will go to industry events and hear people say things like, well, young people don't go to the cinema anymore. Really? Because is that what the numbers say? No, young people go to the cinema all the time. That's who actually goes to the cinema. What you are saying maybe is young people only go to genre films, or young people tend to go to not their domestic film. Yeah, this is maybe true, but then don't tell the wrong story, because if you're telling the wrong story about the problem, you will not be able to act rationally in looking for answers. And then there's like a big storytelling problem, which is that when our stuff connects, so for Finland, for instance, does have a really positive relationship to domestic film. The population is 5.6 million people. I'm pretty sure, Lisa will correct me later if I'm wrong, but I think 2 million tickets were sold to domestic films last year. That's 2017 levels. That's fantastic. In a country of less than 6 million people, 2 million tickets, over 2 million tickets were sold to domestic films. That's fantastic. That's great. In Finland, certainly, like in smaller towns, the cinemas are carried by the domestic film. So when it succeeds, when those like exceptions, when it does succeed, and this is again different in different countries, not so good in Sweden, for instance, in Finland even it works. So how is it possible to threaten a cut of, a third or a quarter of the public film funding? And why would you do that? Because in a national budget, arts funding is chicken shit money. Like, those sums are so trivially small. And if you have an extremist sort of populist government, you can absolutely do that for sort of as a symbol issue. That's one reason to do it. But if you don't have like an extreme, I'm sure some people would say that Finland has an extremist government, but sort of just like looking at it internationally speaking, it's a relatively normal today sort of center-right government. And if you do significant cuts in the art, I happen to believe as a fact, that sort of as a true fact, I believe that undermines like the democratic system over time. So I think that's a very sort of bad decision. It's a counterproductive decision. Also, we know that those tax euros are very productive. A lot of it comes back in different ways to the state coffers, even though some of those studies aren't always entirely reliable. But like generally speaking, this is a very, very productive way of supporting an industry compared to many other industries that our government support. So where does it break? Like, why is it politically possible to make these kinds of cuts? And now, of course, it is possible that the political cost was too high in Finland. That might be one of the reasons why they have backed down. But generally speaking, we need to tell a story. There needs to be a story told of like why do we have arts and culture? Why do we fund it publicly? The things that you love, they exist only because this funding exists directly or indirectly. They rely on it. We have failed in telling that story. And you know what? Nobody else will be telling that story. We need to tell it to the wider population. We need to talk about how films are made and by whom, and like you can be in this world and like you can be part of this source. And also the people who feel underrepresented. We want them to not defund filmmaking. We want them to join and become filmmakers themselves. So one way or the other, there's a storytelling problem here, where even when our domestic content is succeeding, that doesn't translate into a narrative of where that money needs to be protected. Denmark, for instance, is another Nordic example of a country where that narrative is much stronger, where the local love and engagement with the local content has translated into sort of protection of the funding, at least to some degree. And we're going to have to tell this story because nobody else will. That's clear. Tamara Tatishvili talks about this in the report about that there's a kind of sort of demand and entitlement. We are very used as an industry to having this support, and we can become a little bit sort of petty and like pissy when it's taken away. And I'm not saying that that's what happened in Finland, for instance, but like over time, like it's difficult to be in the arts, of course, and we are always fighting budget cuts. Always, it's difficult. We never have enough money, so we do become a little bit bitter and complaining, and we should do that over coffee. But in the public, we just come across as entirely entitled if we do that. No, the story you have to tell is not that it's unfair that the industry support is taken away from an industry that needs it. It's why is this important? What is being taken away from the citizens? What is being taken away from the sort of longevity of the political system in which the politicians work, and so on. And then there is this thing about being able to speak to people with the work, right? So Samia, we talked to a lot of people this last winter, of course, talked about adolescence in the interviews, and Samia says, adolescence is made to educate, to create empathy, to create understanding. It's a technical marvel, as in it's an artistic and technical marvel, right? But it's made for people. Sometimes filmmakers make technical marvels for their colleagues. Then don't be super surprised if only your colleagues like it and the general audience does not. If you make it for your colleagues or for the awards circuit, then that is what it will be good at. There's nothing wrong with that, but don't expect a general audience if you have not thought about the general audience in your process. And this is the other responsibility that I think we as an industry have to face, because you tell that story about why film is important to the citizens, then the citizens need to feel that it delivers and respect them and respects their intelligence, which I would argue that a show like Adolescence does. So we have to challenge our narratives. We have to transform perceptions in the wider culture. We have to learn how to talk about our own work without sounding entitled or patronizing about the audience. And we can start by celebrating our love for film and the audience's love for film. That's a great place to meet in this discussion and this narrative about why is it that this is important. And also that's a way to tell a better story about audiences and film. Okay, then in the report follows two chapters that are about the sort of huge structural changes in the sort of filmmaking value chain, about what's happening in development and early on, and about what's happening once the work is finished and how it gets out there to connect with the audience. I can't, of course, again, like walk through all of it here, but the sort of top level thing is that whenever anything in the value chain changes, of course, it has to change. Like you have to change all of the steps, right? As in any process. But historically, of course, we have been very siloized in this industry, and we haven't been needed to or been expected to work across this sort of duration or the life cycle of a work. Certainly not if you're a producer, for instance, or if you're a creative. And we have to do that, and it means that there are certain practices that we need to change, and especially to solve our audience problems, we have to also rethink how development works to solve our sustainability problems financially that also connects to this and so on. So Ted here is talking about the sort of big commissioning organizations like the big streamers, for instance. He's an agent, an American agent. And so the question is that there is, as the consolidation has made companies bigger and bigger, what often has happened organizationally is that there are more and more layers of decision making with the big commissioners, big streamers, for instance, and big networks. More and more people have their say, and that creates this sort of filter where getting something new through or something unpredictable through becomes harder and harder. And he says, you hear things like, we're reading internally, and you don't hear, I'm going to make this happen, or I'm going to be the champion on the inside. And he says, it's not that I'm suggesting people make things they don't want to, but I miss the energy of willing it to happen. And Marianne Furuvold, who is a Norwegian producer, known, for instance, for Scum, says that she's worried, as also like now, of course, as working with NRK also in commissioning, I'm sorry, is that the worry is that the financial pressures are forcing compromise on the industry. And I think we all know this to be true. Projects don't have the time to have truly top class scripts. and there's not enough time to prepare, which means that, well, the work maybe doesn't come out of class because you can't fix the script in post, but also all kinds of other problems, that come up in the shoot, you have to compromise solve in post-production instead of smartly solve more affordably earlier. We have to be much better about this. And I know that's not how our funding is structured, but this means that we have to change the way our funding is structured. We develop too many projects, but we also develop too few projects. We develop projects way too fast, but we also develop some projects for way too long, and development is frustrating and it's often adversarial. All of these things are true, and that might be a clue that we are not doing this right. So the very high level of my idea of based on the experts, how we should think about this. Development starts with project design. You decide the project's content and focus on artistry in conversation with its business model, in conversation with audience design. And the budget has to be determined by all of these factors. The budget isn't determined by my idea of what this project would cost this much. I mean, yes, of course, that's the first step you do. Then you have to figure out, does that way of funding, do those cash flows exist in the marketplace in reality as we are experiencing it now? If it's not possible to get it funded, and if the funding and if the long-term viability of that funding, if you can get it funded kind of accidentally, you can squeak through, but it doesn't actually connect to an audience that is proportional to the cost later in the value chain, then it's not sustainable, and you shouldn't be spending that money on that, because if you get that budget once, that should be for a project that will actually generate the kind of audience relationship and impact that you would want for your company or for your career. So thinking about creative development, what ways often happens in the room is that we are doing these gradual iterations, these gradual changes to make a thing better. And I think a better way of approaching this would be to think about development is when we test the changes that we think will make it better. Instead of saying, well, here's another rewrite, we're saying, okay, here are the problems that we think this has. And now we are going to do a rewrite, and how do we test whether we have solved these problems or not? Devising a meaningful test requires us to be explicit and specific about what needs proving or improving. A vague sense that this isn't quite punchy enough is very difficult to actually address. And unfortunately, that's still the kind of notes one often gets. We need to honestly discuss especially across the sort of funding and production, or the development side. Everybody involved at that stage needs to talk about what would it take to achieve it, and how would we know whether we had achieved it or not? Through testing, we can challenge or confirm our own assumptions. We can gather exploratory data to catalyze new approaches and also new information about the audience or the subject matter. And later, we can use that same exploratory data to demonstrate both to ourselves and to the talent we want to onboard, and to our funders and to the distributors, that these innovations and the artistic vision that we want this project to have, the artistic quality and the cost of this project, are viable. And this sort of connects to everything we're talking about in a way. I think a DP can show that, or a test can show, that a specific DP is the right choice, or it can show that what would it cost to reach a specific kind of person in a specific market with advertising. But a test can also be devised to show, does my artistic innovation in this film, does my creative approach make the audience feel intelligent or stupid? Because I think if we're making art that makes the audience feel stupid, we have to have a conversation with ourselves about the ego. And that's something that you can totally do, but then don't be upset if they don't show up or recommend your film to others. And this is even within art house audiences. I certainly am a festival person, but I think I'm pretty smart. That's part of my self-image is that I'm pretty intelligent. And if a film makes me feel dumb, I'm not gonna love it. I might still anxiously recommend it to people to seem cool, but I'm not gonna love it. I'm not gonna recommend it in a way that counts. development is super frustrating, and it has to be better compensated, because we, like, even now we can't afford to do even the things we're already doing. We have to evolve the development process to a place where the project's content and focus and artistry are developed together with its business model and audience design, always with testing at the core. And if you change any of those aspects, for instance, you change the business model, you have to think about what it does to the format. And since we don't have enough public money anyway, I think a really rational strategy for a professional upskilling and business innovation in this industry for sustainability is to put more money into development. I genuinely believe this. And at the other end of the value chain, then the question is, what do we know about getting the work and the word out? And surprisingly much, there is quite a lot of things that we know that I don't feel are very well distributed. And I was joking when we wrote this report, and I haven't actually fully said, like, I haven't fully let this idea go. That maybe next year we don't do a Nostradamus report. We just do like 100 case studies of like really intelligent ways that people are doing these things, like testing or distributing something, or like stuff that has already worked somewhere, so that you could just steal it and use it for yourself. I think that would be fantastic. Then I also think maybe that's not actually what we should be doing, but somebody should be doing that. Maria Furvold says, I don't feel at the moment that we're taking publishing, marketing, and release strategies seriously enough. I hear the same from all of my broadcaster colleagues. If we don't have the capacity or money for traditional marketing, which for structural reasons we don't, what else can we do? We have to work within our means. We have something to learn from documentary film, which is good at creating that moment. And Samia says, with the way we market things now, with a poster at a bus stop or a bit in a talk show whose average audience is 60 years old, is probably far from your target audience. You have to come towards them. And if you only come towards people when you have something to sell, that is a very cold relationship, and people can tell. A project content and let's say that, yeah. Dropping that. You can market your way into a cultural moment. Like, you can advertise your way to create a cultural moment. Maybe. And actually, I've looked at some case studies in the report where I'm saying maybe you can't actually. But that's one of the ways that exist. Like, you can throw money at this problem, or you can build engagement over time with your project, or you can engage with an existing community to start to sort of position your project. And these are kind of the three ways that work. Maybe the two ways, because the money, just pure money solution, maybe doesn't actually even work, possibly. So whether you're building engagement over time, which means a relationship, or you're engaging with an existing community, which means relationships take time and projects come and go. So a more sustainable approach for this might actually be to build credibility for an artistic voice or for a curatorial brand. And the thing to remember here is that when you're building relationships, you are not targeting consumers with a marketing message. Like, that way of thinking about it has to go. Even the people who are already fans of the IP, or even already fans of you, they are not people that you are selling content to. You can't think about them like that. They are people that you hope will vouch for your content for others. So fans, especially, their social relationships and their voices is how the commitment for other people to experience your work is created. So the important thing here is, like, it's not like the audience should be grateful to be permitted to see your work or to have some piece of content online or so. No, what we should be grateful. We should be grateful that the audience cares at all. And certainly that they are willing to use their platforms to make things come about. So then it's also a little nuanced thing about this that's relevant, I think, for many of you, is that we have this sort of secret window which has become very significant for art house films, certainly, which is sort of festival tour. And because of all kinds of things, like our storytelling problems that I mentioned earlier, we do struggle with many kinds of art house films in our local markets. Katarina Tomkova, the producer, says the film that I cooperated on had the same number of admissions in Slovak theaters for its entire run as its festival world premiere. So at an A festival, if you get like 4 screenings, there's 4,000 people in the room every time, and then the film goes on to 100 festivals, as in her example, that's a lot of people, and we often don't even count them. So we don't count that as success for the fund, for our local funding. We don't count those as audiences, for instance. That is insane. So here again, I know some of you are funders, to think about this and to think about even how can we document and publish, maybe like who has those numbers. If you, the producer, has the numbers. Festivals don't have any huge interest in keeping this stuff secret. You can certainly gather it from them if you can't find it publicly anywhere. And to make that legible to the funding systems, and to make that legible as impact would be another way of thinking about it. And then to use, of course, every screening all around that tour is an opportunity to convert people to become the ambassadors of this title once it reaches their market in some other way, for instance, on streaming. So the work of creating an interest or a cultural moment starts early, it takes long, and it leverages curatorial brands and existing communities. Online audiences are not people that you sell to, but people that we invite and care enough about to show up. We care about them so much. We allow them to care so much about our work that they will show up and they will personally promote it in their networks, and therefore we need to care about them. So yeah, we need to change everything about how we make films and everything about how we talk about films. So that, and also the economic situation is awful, and then there's also AI. So yeah, that might sound very depressing. That's sort of unfortunately a little bit my brand, but I did put in an extra chapter at the end of just like how lovely is the situation also that we are currently in, artistically speaking. Morad Koufan from France Télévisions said, this year at Séries Mania, I said to Frédéric Lavigne, who curates the selection, WTF, that's not what he said, WTF, not a single show that I would not buy. Such high quality, so impactful, so well written and well acted. I returned to work with a heart full of hope. All the shows were wonderful, but they were all sad. You cry and cry. It was wonderful. Roman Paul says, projects have to be entertaining. I don't believe in boredom. They should always be aesthetically interesting and socially relevant. People are not afraid of tragedy, as long as it resonates with them, as long as it's something about they deeply care about. And it's important to make it unexpected. Returning to Adolescence, Morad says, the third episode of Adolescence is great TV. It's one table, 2 chairs, 2 actors. You don't need 20 million euros for that. If you want to make Kabul or the Count of Monte Cristo, you need money, of course. But the most powerful visual effect is still a close-up on the face of your main actress or actor. Sean Baker, who directed Anora, made his 2015 film Tangerine on 3 iPhones. And I gotta tell you, like, these iPhones are a lot better today than they were 10 years ago. If you really want to say something, Morad says, you don't need me. You don't need a broadcaster. You need your imagination. And finally, Samia Hafsawi says, I don't think that making a commercial film is about making something lazy or vapid for mass consumption. I will fight tooth and nail for people to understand that how you make money is to find things a big group of people love. People go to the Minecraft movie because they love Minecraft. People watch Adolescence because they love their children, their daughter, their sister, and it specifically scares them to lose the people they love to hatred. And people see the theatrical re-release of Pride and Prejudice because they love love. There are many other examples, but I think in the end, this is the sanity check for all of our projects, even the ones that are about difficult things. The relevance comes through something being important to us because we love it. So in this moment, if we genuinely believe that storytelling is important, then what follows from that is that our work needs to resonate with many people often, and it needs to resonate with different people deeply. This is actually how the industry will become resilient and independent. We have to stop resisting the insight that no one else will change the industry for us. We have to accept it to be true. No one else will do this work. This industry has to change itself for ourselves. Then we can also provide real resistance where it really counts. Thank you very much. This is the link. I hope somebody can put it in the chat, perhaps, to where you can find all of our Nostradamus stuff, and also the download of the report, which is free. And there's we try to link our other content there as well. I also write about children's film sometimes and things like that. So I say thank you.